So as a young woman, are you compromising with your boyfriend who is not a Christian? As a young man, are you selling yourself short on your spiritual principles to please this girlfriend who is not a believer? If you're finding yourself already as a person who tends to be a different person when you're with these unbelievers,
welcome once again to the Let Us Go Deeper podcast. I'm here with Pastor Inskip Allsop. And Pastor, we are going straight in today to deal with what goes on in our lives in a very real way. Because one thing we are faced with constantly is making the right decisions.
yes,
And what is a very critical and important decision in anyone's life is the partner you choose to marry and who you attach yourself to for a lifelong relationship.
so you're saying that our lives are sort of like the, how should I put it, the sum total of our decisions and the other thing that happened to us along the way, and that there are some decisions that are more important than others.
That's exactly right.
And you are saying that marriage become one of those major decisions.
Yes, it's so central because it's such a defining decision for the large portion of one's life.
I like that. It's for the largest portion of your life, because we have more years to be married than to be single generally. You get married at 20, 25, 26, and then at 70, 80, you're still probably married. So yes, that is true. Therefore, if you're talking about bad decisions in terms of Israel, then perhaps you need to see how this issue of marriage plays in to their success or failure, and whether marriage is as big a deal as you're making it right now.
Yeah, and for me, marriage, Pastor, is this theme that cuts across. It's one of these themes that cut across Scripture because it takes on different shapes and forms in terms of how God uses it to communicate to us the essence of the most intimate of relationships.
Okay. And if that is so, then we should be able to see in Scripture that played out in Israel's experience and a few other great characters of the Bible, where the marriage became that defining decision of their life. So let's look at what Nehemiah thought about their intermarriage, because one of the problems that we are having here in Israel is the intermarriage of the Jews with the people around them. And remember, in our last couple episodes, we spoke about the fact that the people, in making a commitment to God, in being revived, one of the determinations was, we will not marry outsiders. We will not marry.
Why was that important, by the way? Why was the marrying outsiders an issue to make...
to keep the pure blood. Actually, it says that later on, our keeping a pure blood. So let's see what Nehemiah says in chapter 13, 23 to 25.
This reads, "In those days also I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And I confronted them, and cast them, and beat some of them, and pulled out their hair, and I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin." Wow.
Even him, one of the wisest men, a man who started off with such devotion to God, he said, Lord, I don't want money, I don't want wealth, I don't even want the destruction of my enemies. I want wisdom to lead your people. And here Nehemiah is saying, even he was led astray by his liaison, his love life, his marriage to foreign women. Ezra 9, 1 and 2 also adds another picture to it.
You said Ezra 1?
9. Ezra 9, 1 and 2.
That reads, "After these things had been done, the official approached me and said, The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites.
They have not separated themselves, have not kept themselves as a pure blood. They have intermarried with the peoples around them.
Why was being pure blood such an important aspect or reality for the Israelites?
Well, for one thing, Nehemiah says, for the people, their children could not speak the language of the Hebrews, but they were speaking the language of the peoples around. So they lost their language. You lose your language, you lose a whole part of yourself. You lose a very intrinsic way in which you communicate. You lose your language.
And maybe the reason I'm even pressing this past is because in the age we find ourselves in, this needs to be clearly articulated, because otherwise it may be construed to mean what it's not meaning.
But that is why we need to take it step by step, because I know it comes over like, pure blood, white supremacist, Hitler and his pure Aryan race kind of stuff. It does come over that way. But there's a very, how should I put it, a very real concern in Nehemiah and Ezra for the survival of themselves as a people. Because he mentioned Solomon precisely because God had said, way back with Moses, do not let your kings marry foreign women, because they will turn their hearts away from me to follow other gods. That was a clear-cut instruction. He also said no Moabite up to the 10th generation should enter into Israel. Again, the idea being they will turn your hearts away. So when Nehemiah says, even we have lost the language, it is showing that as the children were growing up in these homes, the wives who had more of the nurturing of the children didn't speak to them Hebrew, didn't read Torah for them, but they would speak about their gods in their languages. And you should know what it's like to grow up your child in a bilingual home where your wife speaks one language, you speak one language, and we find ourselves trying to find a common language for the child to grow up in, and usually it's the dominant language in which you live in. So when these Hebrews, these Jews had married these foreign women and foreign men, the pervading culture was that of the peoples. And so their own language, in which would include their scrolls, because remember the law was written in Hebrew.
And that's why I think, that's why I think we need to be very clear, because we find ourselves now at a time when the idea of knowing another language is actually cherished.
But language here has a deep symbolic meaning here.
That's what we need to bring out.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's literal language that lost, but Nehemiah is using it in a very deep symbolic sense of, if
their
you
way of
lose
life,
your language, you lose your way of life, your communication,
your value system,
yes,
your principles.
Because the law was not written in the language of the Canaanites. It was not written in the language of the Egyptians or Ashdod or any of these other places. It was written in Hebrew.
So it wasn't, as much as he was speaking about language, it wasn't necessarily speaking about the text of how they communicated day to day.
No, but language in terms of my identity.
Right.
My identity. Like, for those of us who are black people in America and in the West, when we go to Africa, when we meet people who come from Africa, there's a barrier. We see that similarity in our skin, our face. We hear that the slaves came from West Africa, whatever, but we can't communicate. Even our names are not named. Why do you think Nebuchadnezzar changed the names of the slaves that they brought down, of Daniel and Azariah, into Babylonian names? Why? Because if I take your language away,
I erase
a lot of your history,
your
your
roots,
identity.
yeah.
Yes, your roots. And so Nehemiah is saying, our children are growing up not knowing the faith of their fathers because they can't read the scriptures. They can't read Torah. They're not being instructed in the ways of our God, but in the ways of their mother's gods, who are not converts to Judaism. And that was the problem. So the intermarriage here is not about racial intermarriage. Like, black shouldn't marry whites or Indians shouldn't marry Japanese. That wasn't really the issue. The pure blood here was spiritual blood of faithfulness to God. But do you remember the story of Balaam and Balak?
Yes, of Balak trying to get Balaam to curse the children of Israel.
And he tried, but
Failed.
why did he fail?
Because of the Israelites' commitment to God and loyalty and
Yes.
and fealty, yeah.
And that is what Balaam told Balak. Balak said, come on, you're supposed to be this great curser. Why don't you? He said, I can't. Because the people are true to God and he has put a hedge around them.
So, and there are layers to this that, Pastor, I need you to help us really pull back, because the people in showing or in being in loyalty to God, there's a marriage there that is being expressed to God himself. And
Okay.
yet there's also the level of marriage to each other that maintains their purity.
You mean Israelite to Israelite?
Yes.
In that sense. Okay, yes. And there's a reason why marrying Israelite to Israelite would keep the purity and the commitment to God, because we are all in the same Israelite boat. We are all the redeemed people of God who have come out of Egypt. So Balaam, understanding this great principle of marriage, what it could mean, he says to Balak, you really want to curse these people and make them weak? Infiltrate them. How will he infiltrate them?
Through this process of intermarriage.
Yes, he says, send your daughters into the camp. Let the men marry your daughters and let the daughters marry your sons. And gradually, they will erode Israel's commitment to their God and introduce your worship and your way of thinking. And then you would be able to attack these people and destroy them. And that is exactly what happened. Balaam, the prophet, is cursed. Even in Revelation, his name comes up as an accursed name because of what he did to God's people. That, I call it the Balaam principle, the Trojan horse principle. Infiltrate your enemy by pretending to be a friend, by unions, by liaisons, by
association,
by being yoked to those who do not believe as you do, and who will erode your own sense of identity and commitment. And that is exactly what happened to Israel. And that is why the issue of intermarriage is such a big deal for Ezra and Nehemiah. And in some way should be to us too.
Yeah, how does that look like today? Because that makes sense in a time when the community lived in a specific region and together, and they could maintain that kind of purity.
But even when they moved out of that setting, what does Paul say in 2 Corinthians 6:14?
2 Corinthians 6:14 reads, do not be unequally yoked with the unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness?
And why that in its context is not specifically pointing to marriage, it includes marriage and any business liaison, friendship, any kind of yoking or closeness with someone who, like Psalm 1 says, blessed is the man who walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. In other words, David is saying Psalm 1, what Paul is saying in 2 Corinthians 6:14, what Ezra and Nehemiah is speaking in Ezra and Nehemiah. Close association to those who hold your God and his ways in ridicule has a diluting effect on your own commitment and your own relationship. Because most intermarriages lead to disaster and end badly.
How do you mean intermarriages of what form?
In the context of spiritual intermarriage, where I as a believer marry an unbeliever. Someone who has no faith in God, someone who treats spiritual things carelessly and lightly. It hardly ever ends well. Because of what we said even earlier on, our own human tendency to go back to the old ways, the backsliding that is part of us, the fact that revival and reformation are not constant and need to be renewed. If I'm in a marriage with someone who does not hold my spiritual view of fervor or devotion, I'm constantly battling within my own inner circle in the most intimate relationship of my life. an eroding effect to my spirituality. And that is what happened to Solomon. So many women with their foreign gods that he had to please them, it just began to drain him to the point where he just went all the way out till he became a pagan himself. And many Christians can attest that they can barely hold on to God in these kind of relationships, and many of them walk away. So Paul has a good advice for us in 1 Corinthians 7, 12 and 13.
To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good.
1 Corinthians 7, 12 and 13.
I'll have to edit there.
Yes.
To the rest I say, I know the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of the husband. Otherwise your children will be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace.
I don't know if you're seeing the two sides of that coin. I don't know if you're really seeing what Paul is trying to say. He says, if you're a Christian and you're married to an unbeliever, he says, don't divorce. There's no need to separate. If that unbeliever desires to stay with you and maintain that marriage union, he said, but on the other hand, if the unbeliever decides, I don't want this, he said, let him go or let her go. God has called you to peace. What I'm seeing here is the, how should I put it? The litmus test of whether an intermarriage can work or not. In other words, even in the Bible, we have intermarriages that worked well. Can you think about at least one intermarriage of one of God's people with someone who was none of the Israelites that worked well?
I mean, the famous one is of Boaz.
Yes.
And Ruth.
And Ruth was a Moabite. And she was under the 10th generation, because the Bible says at least up to the 10th generation, not one Moabite should become part of Israel. And yet she was able to marry a very prominent member of the Israelite community and become a foremother of King David and of Christ ultimately. So is God inconsistent? No. It is because being an unbeliever is more than not belonging to Israel. Being an unbeliever is more than not belonging to a Christian church. It's an attitude of disrespect towards spiritual things or to the God of the person who seeks to marry this other person. So Ruth, being a Moabite, said, your God
is my God.
Your people
are my people.
She left where she lived and went with Ruth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Rahab, the harlot too, became a mother of King David. She was a Canaanite. These people were destined for destruction. They were devoted to destruction, weren't they? Yet she saved. Why? Because even being a Canaanite, living in Jericho, and a harlot or someone who had a brothel, we think, she said, but I've heard about your God. And I think I want to be part of your people. I'm going to help you so that you can help me. So notice she's a Canaanite, the people destined for destruction, but yet in her mind, in her spirit, she was not. She had grabbed hold, to the hope that is found in Israel's God.
But Pastor, in reading Paul's words, it seems to me it's contrary to the earlier propositions, the earlier positions you were taking of maintaining purity, because Paul is suggesting, at least in my view, that we can actually purify the outsider.
He's not suggesting that, really. What he's saying is, if an outsider chooses to maintain that marriage relationship, and of course he's talking about people who were married and then accepted the gospel, not people who went out and found someone who was not of the gospel. But even so, Timothy's father was not a Jew. You know that. Timothy's father was not a Jew, yet he grew up well. He didn't go, apparently his father was a good guy.
But these seem to me to be exceptions rather than the rule. And is
Which
Paul,
ones are the
is Paul
exceptions?
speaking to the exceptions? Ruth and Boaz, Rahab, Timothy's father.
And that's exactly the point that I was making from the beginning, that caused Nehemiah and Ezra to be so adamant against the intermarriage. Like I said, most intermarriages don't go well, lead to disaster, spiritual disaster and shipwreck. But there will always be exceptions. And the key is not necessarily the fact that, let's say I'm a Seventh Adventist and you're not, so I can't marry you. Or I'm a Christian and you're a Muslim, so I can't marry you. That is not necessarily what determines the case. What is your attitude towards my God and towards spiritual things? For oftentimes, as happened with Ruth, the meeting of a Christian, the interaction with a Christian, the close relationship with a Christian is the avenue by which God is able to draw a seeker unto himself. Could you see that?
Mm-hmm.
So you meeting a young lady who is not a Christian doesn't automatically write her off as a possible spouse at some point. You may be exactly the channel through which God is drawing her as a seeker to himself. But it's the discerning of her attitude and her spirit towards God and spiritual things that is the key. I've also known people who were not Christians, who got married to Christians, who themselves became Christian. My brother-in-law is a perfect example of that. When he met my sister, I was totally against their marriage. I was like, he's not a Christian, you know. And the Bible talks about being unequally yoked. She said to me, but I love him. And he said to me, he said, but I love your sister. And I've always wanted to do what was right, but your sister has turned my life around. I was totally against it. My sister decided she was going to marry him. Do you know what? This man came into the church, got baptized, became such a faithful member, became a deacon. Until today, 40 years later, he's still holding on. In fact, when my sister seemed wobbly, he was the one who kept the ship upright. And I could call many cases where that is so. However, Nehemiah and Ezra weren't willing to take that chance, and they were very adamant in that the Israelites had to put away all your wives and all your children born of these wives. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so maybe when going back to last week's discussion on backsliding, it seems to me then the larger point that is being made here is that since we are more inclined to move always back to that sinful, rebellious position, these marriages are more likely to pull us back into those states.
Yes. Yet, such a marriage could pull that person, rescue that person out. But that is why Paul says, if the unbeliever decides to stay with you, meaning he supports you, he wants to keep this marriage going, he says there's no need to divorce. But if the unbeliever, he says, wants to separate, meaning, I don't care about you and your Jesus of Nazareth. I don't want to be any part of this. He said, let them go, because God has called you to peace. Not to be wrangling and harassing your spirit and fighting with someone who chooses not to walk in your pathway. With Nehemiah and Ezra, the situation was there were compromises made among those who intermarried that would send the people back into an apostasy that would not have been good. Like what Eliashib did, remember, with Tobiah, and actually used the temple as a living space. That kind of compromise, the very fact that the people's children were not learning Torah and about God, meant in 1 or 2 generations, the knowledge of God could be wiped out. So it was a drastic time that called for drastic measures. I am not suggesting that if somebody marries someone today and realizes she's an unbeliever, they should walk away and absolve their marriage. But it does give pause of what preachers often say, if when you get married, there isn't total honesty and openness, then there is no marriage taking place because you're getting married under false pretense. I do believe some people are married unwisely. It's a bad decision. And if, as we said, marriage could be one of the determinants of your success and failing the spiritual road, even in your success in life.
Yeah.
If marriage is such a big decision, then to marry on impulse, on passion, and any other platform that is not, this is God's will, this is the one God has chosen for me, this person possesses the traits and qualities that will build me up spiritually and otherwise, it is a bad decision, a very bad decision, one from which one would have a lot of regrets in one's life.
And so it's to maintain that view of the significance of this decision to partner with somebody and to determine for yourself, and maybe that pastor becomes the key piece. Where are you in terms of your capacity to engage with somebody who may be from outside?
Yes. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So I guess, Joel, while we are talking about marriage, there's also friendship. The people you hang out with, your buddies that you hang out with on your job, in college, in the university. Who are you in these settings? Are you a different person when you're with your buddies? Do you make sacrilegious jokes? Do you find yourself participating in activities and conversations that you would ordinarily not do and be embarrassed of? That could be a good key to Joel. When Paul says don't be unequally yoked, he's saying, when you become one of those persons who walk in the way of the ungodly, stand in the way of sinners, and sit in the seat of scoffers, and allow yourself to become comfortable in that sort of apostate, irreligious environment, you are showing yourself incapable of standing up in a marriage with an unbeliever. Definitely, because that person will finish the job and pull you totally away. So as a young woman, are you compromising with your boyfriend who is not a Christian? As a young man, are you selling yourself short on your spiritual principles to please this girlfriend who is not a believer? If you're finding yourself already as a person who tends to be a different person when you're with these unbelievers, if the conversations are sacrilegious and irreligious, if you are embarrassed to speak about church and God in their company, you are in the wrong company. And definitely shouldn't marry someone like that. It will complete the job of destroying you spiritually. And this is what happened in Israel. That led them into apostasy in the time of Balaam. That led them into apostasy in the time of the kings. That led them into apostasy further on, like Ahab. And even now, Ezra and Nehemiah are saying, we can't afford to do this because we cannot repeat the mistakes of Solomon and all these other kings and Israelites that led us to be in this difficult situation. Get rid of these women. Get rid of their children. A harsh decision, but this was a particular case. A desperate, a desperate situation called for desperate measures? Is that what you say?
Yeah, desperate times, yeah.
Yes, was one of them. Today, we are not in that sort of desperate situation. Today, we cannot use race and culture and creed as determinants for marriage in a spiritual sense, but definitely we need to hear what Paul says, not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And I would dare say, there may be times and there may be persons for whom an unbeliever, there may be situations in which a dedicated child of God, a son or daughter of God, like Boaz, for instance, may meet a non-Christian, a seeker for truth, someone who is not irreligious, someone who is not frivolous, someone who is a seeker. And that relationship could blossom into marriage. That can happen. It has happened and will continue to happen. I don't know if you are that person or if your boyfriend or your girlfriend is that person. This is where discernment becomes necessary. And the principle of not being unequally yoked is a safety from which you're much better off following that than taking a chance.
Yeah, Pastor, and thank you for bringing us around to that end. And maybe just here to finish, what is the larger point here in light of the gospel? Because I'm trying to understand where this is pointing us to ultimately as believers in our time and moving to the end time.
It is leading us to being discerning, to being consecrated and committed to the way that we know, and to be aware that just as happened with Balaam, a people could be consecrated and dedicated to God, receiving his favor, and allow themselves to be infiltrated by the Trojan horse of illicit relationship with an unbeliever that destroys.
And this relationship could actually, because I want to also make the bigger point that it's not just about marital relationship, it's just connecting with these touch points or these external appeasements, I will say even maybe gods, for lack of a better word, things that you attach yourself to that can draw you away.
I appreciate you bringing that up again and re-emphasizing that we're not only talking about marriage, even though it started off with marriage back in those days. Today, we are around so many people in a country like ours, a pluralistic society. You're rubbing shoulders with different races and creeds and cultures and religions, etc. So that principle has to be extended to any close, intimate relationship with someone who holds your God.
Yeah. Or even with something, Pastor, I will even say, because even value systems that are outside of what we have identified as what is central in our spiritual journey can attract us away from these truths.
Yes. But usually, it will come in the face and in the body of another human being who draws you and allows you to experience that other thing that's attracting you.
Mm-hmm.
A friend, a colleague, a co-worker who say, hey, why not let's try this? So yes, again, we need to be discerning. And Paul is telling us today, be careful. You are safer not having close relationship with unbelievers than if you decide I'm brave, like Solomon. I could handle this. I'm a man of God. I know where I stand. That kind of position could lead you into great pain and suffering later on. So you're better off being safe.
Thank you for journeying with us through this season and even for listening to this episode. Let Us Go Deeper is an independent ministry, and your contribution are essential to sustaining this journey. Please make any contributions you may to patreon.com/LUGD. That is patreon.com/LUGD.
And if this is your first time, please subscribe. And if you're one of our regular listeners, share the link. Invite your friends to listen in, and they too can be blessed by this podcast. Let us go deeper.